Hello, Carol here with my design of a permaculture garden. This is my video assignment for Module 19, Permaculture. And I've designed a garden that could be constructed in my current yard. The aim of my garden design is to plan a sustainable living and gardening area which will reduce energy use less or recycle water, make use of natural resources like solar power, reduce household waste, increase my recycling, and use and repurpose more items, provide fresh produce, and create a pleasant personal space. I've aimed to create a garden which is ethical and will improve rather than harm the earth. I've tried to create my design in a way that each element has a beneficial impact on the other elements surrounding it, and I have only selected plants that I'm currently familiar with and know something of their performance and requirements in the existing microclimate of my yard. I've also taken into account my time, my finances, and my ability to construct and maintain the garden, and the limited space I have available. And this limited space pretty much limits me to only a Zone 1, but for the purposes of this assignment, I will create a Zone 2, which will apply to anything more than 5 steps from my doors. My suburban block faces east, with very little sun along the northern boundary, due to shadowing from the fence. The permanent shadow here varies from about 0.5 metre to 1 metre, depending on the season. The most usual wind direction is from the northeast, and it's quite mild. The damaging wind comes in from the south here, but the fencing acts as a windbreak. I'm not far from a beach and a waterway, so there is salt air to consider when selecting plants and materials. The soil in my yard is almost completely sand, so drainage is good, but soil quality is very poor. So the growing beds will be raised no-dig gardens. These will be constructed as much as possible from salvaged, found and recycled materials. Raised growing beds are also needed because there seems to be large lumps of rock in various parts of my garden that have been used as fill sometime in the past. There's no tall trees in the yards of my immediate neighbours, so the sun I get is relatively unobstructed. There are some features and installations in the garden that I've designed that are existing, like the back awning, the native bees and the bore pump, while others need to be added, like the water tanks and the garage and storage areas. Zone 0 is the house and garage. As much as I would like to rebuild and have a nice turf roof that will provide insulation and filter rainwater and provide a refuge for wildlife, that's not an option at the moment, so the existing house stays. In accordance with the second design principle of permaculture, which relates to the capture and storage of energy, there are solar panels on the roof, and there's natural fibre insulation in the ceilings. There's also a solar hot water service, and there's rainwater tanks installed either side here to catch the runoff from the house and the garden, and the garage rather. Moving into Zone 1, the front area of the house, there are some native shrubs along this front boundary. These are all suitably mulched, and they will provide a little privacy from the streets while giving birds a refuge, and also provide some flowers for bees and other nectar eaters. There would also be some nesting boxes here for birds and some suitable nesting tubes for solitary native bees. In area here, which is the very front of the house, I might add some pretty annual flowers to brighten up the front of the house and attract bees. And also perhaps some perfume flowering shrubs. That's something that can tolerate spending their afternoons in the shade. The trees on the nature strip here are designed to add to the number of urban trees and maybe help reduce the urban heat island. I'd like to include some garden space around these trees, as the nature strip is fairly wide with no footpath. But my local council prohibits gardens on the nature strip because of the possible danger to pedestrians, which is a shame. The centre of the driveway will be planted with herbs and strawberries. Still in Zone 1, but at the rear of the house, there's a seating area here under the cover of an awning, which shelters the rear of the house from the afternoon sun, as does the lemon tree, which is surrounded by some fragrant ground cover herbs and some strawberries. Attached to the rear of the house, quite high up, is a native beehive, which is protected from the weather and direct sunlight by the awning. There's a shaded area on the northerly side of the house and garage where there's space for some potted plants, which either like a shaded spot or they can be moved around into other areas. Perhaps some climbing plants can be grown here against the very warm bricks of the house, and this could climb up probably out of the shade of the fence. There's a potting area and garden storage shed at the rear of the garage where gardening supplies and chicken feed can be securely stored in metal storage bins to avoid the vermin and rats around here. The worm farm is over on the southern boundary fence. It's in a shaded area next to the house, but still very close to provide easy access to add kitchen scraps. They're moving away from Zone 1 into Zone 2, but still in very close proximity to the house. The spiral herb garden's not in a very good scale here, I'm afraid, but they would go there. There's sufficient open space on the northerly side of these gardens to allow plenty of sunlight, and the spiral shape provides a variety of growing conditions. The part of the spiral that gets the most sun is good for the herbs that require full sun, while the opposite side has more shade, and is cooler for the herbs that suit those conditions. The further up the spiral we go, the drier and better drained the soil, while the bottom has the dampest growing conditions. So knowing the requirement of each particular herb and the effect it will have on its neighbour, such as will it spread and smother the guy next door, is really important to the system working effectively. Closest to the house is the spiral culinary herb garden. I'll construct this from some old reclaimed bricks I've put aside waiting for a suitable use. And at the top of this would probably be a rosemary bush, while the rest of the spiral is planted with my favourite culinary herbs and maybe some mint or some other moisture-loving herbs at the bottom which can spread out amongst the paving stones. Next to the culinary garden is a medicinal spiral. This will be constructed using the same bricks and possibly topped by a lavender bush with other herbs such as comfrey, lemon balm, aloe vera, borage, making up the rest of the spiral. each planted in a position that suits its own growing requirements. Although there's an overlap between the culinary and medicinal uses for some of the herbs, such as rosemary or the different varieties of mint, I would roughly divide them according to the manner in which I personally use them most often. So herbs such as rosemary, mint, thyme would be located in the culinary spiral, although I use them both for their medicinal properties as well. Some may be doubled up and appear in both spirals, well, because I like them. In a similar position, on the other side of the yard, is a bore pump, a water garden, which can also provide a frog habitat, and a surrounding herb garden for herbs that prefer a more shaded, damp habitat. I've made the edges of the water garden fairly curvy to increase the actual length of the border between the aquatic environment and the herb garden, to increase the interesting interaction between the two environments as per the 11th design principle of permaculture. Behind the water garden is a small greenhouse to make better use of this shaded side of the yard. And behind that, at the rear of the yard, is the chicken coop and the enclosed chicken run. This position is shaded much of the time and protected from the weather by the structures on three sides. This coop would be constructed from found and recycled materials as much as possible, and provide a secure area outside the coop for the chickens to use when they are not out scratching around the garden, gobbling up pests and recycling kitchen scraps, aerating the soil and leaving little poo parcels to fertilise the ground. This meshed outdoor space will allow them out of coop time while protecting them from predators. In the centre of the yard are some raised no-dig garden beds, which, like the chicken coop, would be made as much as possible from salvaged materials. The area on the southern side of the garden would be mainly used to grow plants and vegetables that either grow tall or can be grown on a small trellis, so they don't overshadow the plants growing on the northerly side. This area would be for growing the lower growing vegetables. Individual varieties of vegetables would not all be planted in one place, but as a part of an irregular grouping of plants chosen to create a little micro ecosystem made up of plants that can help each other out and increase the biodiversity in the growing area, which is in accordance with the 10th design principle of permaculture. Also, by planting a mix of plants and following the guidelines of companion planting, rather than just planting in neat rows or groups of the same plant, pests aren't presented with a nice orderly feast of their favourite plant, and it's possible that while a plant may get eaten in one spot, another planting of the same vegetable somewhere else may escape being munched for lunch. The plants chosen will benefit each other for a variety of reasons, such as those with deeper root systems can loosen the soil for others with shallower root systems without depriving them of anything, while others can happily grow on a trellis over the lower plants without shading them, and this maximises the available garden space. Some plants have an aroma which repels insects, and sometimes carefully chosen varieties of plants can ensure that there are flowers close to the veggie patch to attract bees for pollination. The raised beds in my garden have very narrow divisions between the growing areas to allow access for planting, harvesting and maintenance without compacting the soil of the growing area. And these, like the rest of the garden, will be heavily mulched to prevent water loss and deter weeds. The curved edges of these beds and walkways increase the boundaries around the growing areas, giving them more edges, which is recommended to increase biodiversity in the garden. I've divided the raised garden beds into several distinct areas, which allows for easy crop rotation and resting of the soil. At the rear of the veggie patch is a composting area. I've made 3 separate compost piles, and although the small space available means these piles won't be very big, having 3 separate piles means that I can have one pile ready for use, the second pile brewing, while the third pile is the newest pile and still being added to. Unfortunately, the composting space is further reduced because I have to allow space for adding material, for turning the brewing pile and access and moving the compost when it's ready to use. But I figure ease of access and maintenance is important everywhere in the garden to make the whole thing more enjoyable and reduce the amount of labour required. Along the sunnier southern edges of the yard, I've included some trellises for climbers, like some of my favourite, like passion fruit and chocos. This allows for maximum growing space in a small area by growing upwards on a trellis or frame, and it also looks a lot nicer than the boundary fence. As these trellises are the tallest part of my garden, I've situated them on the southern boundary so they won't cast any shadow over the rest of the garden, but will provide some protection from the occasionally fierce southerly winds. There's also space at the base of these trellises to grow other companion planting that would enjoy the full sunshine. The general walkways around the garden would be paved with recycled pavers, bricks and stepping stones, reused after they've been pulled up and put aside when the garden is remodelled. This will allow ground cover plants to fill the spaces between the paving materials. Some fencing will be required around the raised garden beds to restrict and regulate the foraging of the chickens, but this can be easily constructed from salvage materials as the area is not very large. I've aimed to design a garden which conforms to the 3 basic ethics of permaculture and the 12 design principles. My design allows me to take care of the earth, and here they are in a rough idea. My design allows me to look after the earth by improving soil quality and not depleting the soil of nutrients or doing any harm for a short-term gain. I've incorporated things like a composting system to return organic matter to the soil, chickens to reduce kitchen waste, and worms to recycle waste into fertiliser. Chemical use is avoided by selected mixed plantings and companion plantings, and also by having chooks to eat the pests, and washing rather than discarding slightly chewed vegetables. And I've also included refuge and habitat for native species. Designing a garden with the principles of permaculture in mind incorporates the second rule, which relates to taking care of people. I've enjoyed the challenge of designing this garden and designing a garden that won't be a burden on myself or the planet, plus the companionship of discussing my ideas with others. I enjoy collecting and sharing found materials and more often than not pass them off to someone who has greater need of them. I enjoy living in pleasant surroundings, and I enjoy the satisfaction of tending and harvesting my own produce, and also undoubtedly learning from my numerous mistakes, which is as per the fourth design principle when we get to those. Any surplus produce can be shared with family and friends, and this harmonious sharing of ideas, materials and produce fosters a great community spirit, which is quite psychologically rewarding, and it encourages self-worth and a sense of belonging and a sense of personal responsibility for taking care of the earth. My tiny little garden is also a notion, and it's a small example of the notion of fair share. It's an example of me endeavouring to reduce my level of consumption by using recycled materials, natural resources, and reducing the food miles required to provide my food. Any produce additional to my personal needs is shared or swapped in the community, as is my experience, skills and knowledge. I take responsibility for the results that my patterns of consumption have on the earth. And my little garden is a small example of an attempt to limit my consumption and reject the accumulation of fancy garden products and materials and structures that are unnecessary for the sustainable production of food. I've also been mindful of the 12 principles of permaculture when I was drawing up a design for a garden. The first principle requires patience and taking the time to observe what is happening in your garden. It's the observe and interact principle. It might require some time in contemplation to consider the possible consequences any action might have, even if initially it seems like a good idea. If I plant a tree in a certain position, will that affect other plants around it? Will removing a certain plant have a negative effect on the garden as a whole? Perhaps keeping a garden diary will help identify seasonal patterns and the results of any experiments in planting. Having a look what is growing well in neighbouring properties is also helpful. The second principle is the capture and storage of energy in times of abundance, so we can use it later. And that is addressed by the installation of solar panels and water tanks. Also, grey water from the laundry prevents the waste of this water to the sewer. And the greenhouse captures sun's energy to warm the interior. And effective insulation in the ceiling can reduce energy use by preventing heat loss in winter. The third principle says we should obtain a yield and get a reasonable return for our efforts. So it's expected that we will be able to harvest a reasonable amount of produce in return for our work. But we might also gain more than just the vegetables we grow. Maybe we might make new friends and learn new things along the way when we interact with other gardeners. And we gain the personal pleasure of seeing our garden grow and solving their daily problems. We can enjoy the communication and communion with other like-minded gardeners and share information, experience and help each other out if needed. The fourth principle requires us to apply self-regulation and respond to feedback. A garden diary may be of use here so we can see what is working and what is not in our own microclimate and take the required action to fix the problem. It also means we should take advice from people more experienced or knowledgeable and respond well to constructive criticism. It relates closely to that first ethic of permaculture and means that we should make every effort to use every method available to improve the land. The fifth principle relates to the use of renewable resources and encourages us to reduce our consumptive behaviour and consider alternatives that are less harmful to the earth. For example, rather than install metal-based shade structures that use finite resources and harmful chemicals in their manufacture, we might choose timber from a sustainable source. Or we could just plant shade trees and maybe some fruit trees like the lemon tree at the back of my house, which will also help us obtain a yield which we can share with others according to that ethic of fair share. The sixth principle instructs us to produce no waste. My worm farm and compost piles and my chooks are an attempt to comply with this principle, where waste is recycled and finally produces fertiliser to return to the earth. There are also recycled materials used throughout my garden, which reuses items that have been discarded by others as waste. The solar panels and water tanks prevent the waste of resources which would otherwise be lost. The seventh principle relates to design, from patterns to details. Patterns in nature can work extremely well when applied in different settings, like the spiral herb gardens, which mimic the patterns of many things in nature. Another example are rivers that follow a curved pattern, which is mimicked in the curved edges of the garden and also around the water garden. The eighth principle instructs us to integrate rather than segregate. I've tried to follow this principle by not planting orderly beds of the same plant, but instead mixing things up a bit while following the rules for companion planting. This creates a stronger ecosystem which becomes stronger than the sum of its parts. Each plant becomes stronger with the help of the others around it and will lead to the creation of a synergy within our garden. The ninth principle tells us to use small and slow solutions, unlike the huge agro-businesses that demand a quick fix to maximise yields in the short term. Some perennials like citrus and my favourite, rhubarb, take years to produce a decent crop, but they serve other purposes in the garden and they don't disturb the soil or their neighbouring plants by requiring constant replanting. The 10th principle tells us to use and value diversity. The greater the diversity of the plants in the garden, the lesser the risk of the whole garden failing, as it is unlikely that all the varieties will be susceptible to the same pest. There may be some losses, but not the complete loss of the garden. Some taller plants can provide the shade required by others. The aim for me is to establish a garden where the plants provide mutual benefit to each other and become stronger due to the presence of the others and the variety of the others. The 11th principle urges us to use the edges. The boundaries between two different growing areas can be interesting and fertile places. For example, dead leaves can pile up against brick or stone borders and decay into fertile compost. And the outer areas of the yard which do not provide ideal conditions for growing vegetables, such as that northern boundary of my yard that's in shade, can still be used by growing climbers that benefit from the stored warmth in the house bricks, and these could climb up out of the shadow. Or it can be used for pots of shade-loving herbs which can be moved to a sunnier aspect if need be. Using the edges of structures and gardens also maximises the growing space. The 12th and final principle reminds us to creatively use and respond to change. Not every year or season is identical to the last. Weather, pests, and other external forces can vary from one year to the next. The aim is not to control nature, but rather to figure out the best way to respond to these changes to achieve the best outcome. Change is inevitable in both the short term and the long term. So we need to observe our garden and interact with other gardeners to work out solutions to these changes. So there we have it. I've attempted to design a garden that reflects the 3 basic ethics, the 12 principles of permaculture, and everything that I've learnt in the previous modules of this course. I've tried to tie it all together, bring everything into this garden. Instead of trying to achieve a design which creates some kind of, what I'm aiming to do here is to achieve something that will create a self-supporting system and create a synergy and ensure the long-term success of this system, and by incorporating all the aspects we've learnt throughout this course. Thank you very much, and this is the garden I would have maybe when I retire. Thank you very much.